Good evening, everybody. Tonight we have Dr. Doug Kennett. His talk tonight is entitled Maize Domestication and Dispersal in the Americas. Dr. Kennett received his PhD from the University of California, Santa Barbara, and is professor of environmental archaeology and chair of the Department of Anthropology at UCSB. He also held field faculty or faculty positions in anthropology departments of California State University, Long Beach, University of Oregon, and Penn State University. He was head of the department at Penn State and at UCSB. He is associate chair of the Department of Anthropology, director and curator of the Repository for Archaeological and Ethnographic Collections, and the director and coordinator of the Central Coast Information Center. Dr. Kennett has conducted community-based environmental archaeological research in Mesoamerica, Polynesia, and California. He is the author of 250 academic papers and 3 books entitled The Island Chumash, Behavioral Ecology and the Transition to Agriculture, and Taking the High Ground, The Archaeology of Rapa, a fortified island in remote East Polynesia. His current interests include the origins of agriculture, the study of human socio-political dynamics under changing environmental conditions, human impact on ancient environments, and behavioral response to abrupt climate change in the past. Would you all give a warm welcome to Dr. Kennett?
Okay, thank you so much. Hello, welcome the folks that are here and everyone else in Zoomlandia. Glad to be here tonight. So is my presentation going to come up there? Or? Let's see. Yeah. And thanks to Joe and the organizing committee for inviting me here. And I'm glad it's such a unique event to have someone here in person. So I'm glad to kind of get you out. My perspective these days is we need to kind of get together more often in person and not be on Zoom. So hopefully this will stimulate some larger gatherings in person. Today, I wanted to say one thing about the society, which I've been familiar with for a very long time. My early work in the 90s was actually in California. And I actually was an author of a paper with John Erlinson in the PCAS quarterly. So I've been familiar with that journal for a very long time and your society. So it's a pleasure to be here to talk with you all. Today, I'm not going to be talking about work in North America or California, but work that I've been doing over the last 20 years, largely in Mesoamerica, but also in South America, and more focused in on questions related to the origins of agriculture in the Americas. I'm broadly interested in that topic globally, but my focus has primarily been in the Americas and mainly in Mesoamerica and Central America. And in today's talk, I'm just going to talk about some of the work I've been doing on maize domestication and its dispersal throughout the Americas. And of course, that includes dispersal into North America as well, but I'm not going to be focusing so much on that particular topic. I'll be talking about projects that I've been doing in Honduras and in Belize. So the structure of my talk today is going to be, I want to kind of talk a little bit about the really intriguing interdisciplinary work that's being done, focused in on agricultural origins and maize domestication and dispersal in particular, and how that's being integrated with archaeological research and paleoecological research. So it's basically bringing these different disciplines to address this particular kind of question. Then I'm going to turn and just kind of give you, talk about some of the archaeological sites that I've been working at with colleagues down in Central America. I just kind of give you a little bit of a flavor of that, what's going on with that research, which is ongoing. And then at the end, I want to talk about a sort of an interdisciplinary project I've been doing with a group from UC Santa Barbara, where I currently am, and also with UC Davis, a sort of an interdisciplinary project where we're looking at human and maize demography and those linkages throughout the Americas. And we're sort of at the leading edge of that project. So it's more kind of telling you sort of where I'm trying to go with this particular project. Okay, so I'm going to see if I can. This is going to work, not going to.
Your target's over here.
Okay. There's some technical difficulties. Let's just try to. Will that work? Yeah, okay. So I want to start off first with, why does the origins of agriculture matter? Like, why is it relevant? And sort of, I really sort of at least point you in the direction of sort of an exciting body of work that's been done over the last 20 years. And even longer, there's been a long-standing interest in the origins of agriculture within the field of archaeology. And more recently, it's become more and more interdisciplinary to address kind of a wide variety of questions. When I went to graduate school in the 1990s, I took an Origins of Agriculture seminar, and that really kind of got me interested and hooked in thinking about this particular problem. And the map that was shown at that time had 6 areas that were kind of primary origin locations for different kinds of agricultural and different kinds of domesticates and sort of centers of agriculture. Now we're up to 20 different locations where we have independent domestication of different kinds of crops. And interaction and development of agricultural systems in very unique ways in these different areas. So the process starts about 12,000 to 11,000 years ago in the Near East or Southwest Asia. You can see on this map, but there's actually equally early or close to domestication events of different kinds of plants and animals occurring in the Americas by at least 10,000 years ago. And I actually suspect it's actually even earlier than that. That we'll see in the future that archaeological record will ultimately demonstrate that. So this is a global process. This is happening independently in a lot of these different areas. And there we go. All right. I would argue that it's one of the most fundamental transformations that's happened on our planet, leading into the last 10,000 years, both in terms of environmental impacts that agricultural systems have had, but also impacts on society and ultimately sort of cultural developments, including the emergence of your widespread emergence of social inequality and the development of cities and urban centers and large state level societies that we live in today. So really, agriculture kind of has to happen first before you have these kinds of systems developing in the area. So, in different parts of the world. So it's again an interesting process to study. And archaeologists are well positioned to do that and to, again, collaborate in interdisciplinary teams to look at different types of domesticates that are very important and how they're sort of interacting, how humans and these plants have sort of these co-evolutionary developments through the last 10,000 years. And maize is a particularly interesting one. So of course, maize is an incredibly important crop today. You can see, as I'll talk about today, its origins are in southwestern Mexico, but today you find it all over the world. I mean, every place that I visit, I go to Africa, I'll be driving along the street and there's maize, corn growing along the road. I was in Turkey at the end of last year at some of these really impressive early Neolithic sites, and what crop was being grown around them? Corn. Okay, completely foreign plant that's being introduced and is having it's incredibly productive in these different kinds of zones. So it's incredibly adaptive, can be grown in a wide variety of environments. And of course, it's really important for food, fodder, and then fuel. That's sort of the primary uses of this crop globally. So the beginnings of this are in Mesoamerica, in southwestern Mexico. I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the data that we have for some of the early evidence for corn in the Americas. Although I'm focusing in on corn, it's not just that's not the only crop. We have sort of what are called the three sisters, essentially, maize, beans, and squash, that ultimately are grown together and in a very symbiotic kind of way throughout the Americas. So these are other domesticated plants that are, in some cases, with squash, are domesticated earlier than corn, and then are sort of integrated into these agricultural systems. So many of these crops are grown in sort of these early crops are grown in sort of neotropical environments. They spread into highland environments and arid environments, but ultimately there's a lot of early synergy that's going on between humans and these different potential target crops in sort of lowland environments in Central America and extending down into South America. And there's actually quite a bit of interaction that's going on very early on between people in these areas. And since we're focusing on this is called the Pacific Coast Archaeological Society, a lot of that interaction is probably going on via maritime routes along, in coastal settings, linking Mesoamerica down into South America. Let's see if this pointer will work. Yeah. So this is just sort of a little bit of a timeline showing some of the key crops in Mesoamerica, Central America, and then down here in South America. We have squashes, cucurbids that are domesticated very early in both areas, and these look like they're actually independent domestication events. And then you have Zea maize being domesticated in Mesoamerica and Mexico, and then spreading fairly early, fairly rapidly down into South America. And then some interesting interactions that I'll talk about a little bit later in the talk. And then later on in time, we have beans are domesticated and kind of come into the fold. So it's not the agricultural systems don't just emerge together all at once. They're basically individual plants are being experimented with. There are changes, biological changes to those plants. Essentially, people are engineering them through selection. And then ultimately you have pretty remarkable changes in the architecture and biology of these plants. And corn is remarkable in how radical the changes are from the progenitor species, which is known as teosinte. And in fact, very early on, it was recognized by a scholar named Beadle in 1965 that sort of the modern corn is a biological monstrosity that quickly would go extinct without human intervention. Okay, so we have major changes in the structure and character and biology of teosinte. I won't go over all the details of this, but this is what the teosinte plant looks like. It's a grass that grows. There's a number of different species or varieties that occur in Mexico and down into Central America. That has lots and lots of these sort of branches that are branching like this. And then you go to the architecture of the plant of maize, which has a single stalk with leaves and cobs attached to the central stalk here. So that's major changes in the architecture of the plant, and then major changes in the way that the cob and the seed structure are attached. So from a sort of single line of seeds, and seeds that are kind of, I'd like to compare to them like almost like armadillo skin, essentially, so that are incredibly hard seeds, very difficult to access, to especially an exposed seed in corn with multiple rows and what we're familiar with, the cob. Okay, and so starting off fairly small and then getting larger over time. But there's actually a variety of other changes that are occurring, like starch concentrations, sweetness. These are the things that are being manipulated by and selected for by people over 12,000 years or so. Okay, so for the genetic data, there's been a number of studies that have been focusing on teosinte genetics to figure out, which of these grasses is the kind of the wild origin of corn. This is a fairly relatively recent study in 2022 by Chen et al. This map just basically shows the locations of the samples that the geneticists actually analyzed with a variety of different subspecies occurring from this area where you have a large concentration in southwestern Mexico. And then, but there's some of these grasses occur all the way down into Central America here. The two key species, in the domestication story are Zea maize parviglumis. So this blue little dot here, and you can see the concentrations here. This is Zea maize mexicana. Sorry, that's the blue dots. And then the red dot here are the Zea maize parviglumis. And that's, you can see that there's lots of analyses that have been done on parviglumis here. And what this figure down below here shows is that all of these grasses have origins way back in time. And then more recently, we have basically the relationship between Zea maize, so domesticated corn. It's most closely related to Zea maize parviglumis. So those are these red dots here on the map, okay? But it's also interestingly very closely related to Zea maize mexicana, which is a more highland variety of teosinte. It occurs in higher, drier environments than parviglumis. So I'm going to be kind of talking about parviglumis versus mexicana for the rest of the talk in terms of this origin story genetically. So there's a study in 2002 that basically demonstrated that modern maize ultimately comes from Zea maize parviglumis. So that's more of a lowland tropical variety of teosinte that occurs in an area known as the Balsas River Valley in southwestern Mexico, where there's large concentrations there. And that's where the sort of the heartland of maize domestication is thought to be based on the genetic evidence. And then there's basically using the genetic clock, there have been arguments that occurred 9,000 years or earlier. And there have been a couple of recent studies that I actually don't have slides for here that kind of point to possibility of somewhere between 13,000 years ago and 10,000 years ago is the likely interval when maize was ultimately domesticated. Okay. And from this somewhere down in the sort of lowland areas of southwestern Mexico. This is actually a pretty hard part of the world to work in to do archaeological research. But there was one study in the early 2000s by Dolores Pepirno. She went, because of the genetic studies, they wanted to go into southwestern Mexico, into this Balsas River area, and try to get samples. And they worked at a rock shelter site in the Balsas area, and they were able to, they did excavations, and they had found maize starch and phytolith. So these are like microbotanical remains of corn, not corn cobs, but sort of the microscopic remains of corn in archaeological sections dating to almost 9,000 years ago. So at the time, there was a big focus in on 9,000 years ago being sort of the age for maize domestication. So the archaeology seemed to fit with the genetic evidence. Okay, so that's kind of where in the literature right now, sort of 9,000 years is the date that is used for maize is domesticated by at least that time. Okay, and likely earlier. So there's some pretty interesting things that happen environmentally and climatically globally that probably provide some of the context for the interactions that people and these plants came, when they started coming, were coming together. So this is a figure showing some of the major global climatic changes that are occurring that really, I think, really promoted the origins of agriculture generally, and would have, promoted the transition to maize-based agriculture within Central and Mesoamerica. And that's basically this upper figure is showing. These are actually from the Greenland ice sheet. This is like isotopic data showing the major changes that are occurring in climate, going from this period known as the Younger Dryas, which is quite cold. And then, of course, this is coming out of the Ice Age earlier in time, and then basically getting warmer and warmer. So that's basically the context that the transition to agriculture occurs in during this warming period. But the various earliest domestication of corn and many other grasses globally is actually occurring when it's still quite cool. Okay. And which is interesting for a variety of reasons. Another major change that's occurring globally is the CO2 content, or the content of the atmosphere. And so you can kind of think about the Pleistocene. There's like lower concentrations of carbon dioxide, and some people have talked about that as being like a really great environments for animals. And then as the CO2 concentration of the atmosphere kind of increased, that actually kind of favored plants going into and the productivity of plants going into the last 10,000 years. And then specifically in Mesoamerica, there are some pretty major changes in precipitation that occur with the transition from the Younger Dryas going into the last 10,000 years. These figures are this is data from cave deposits. These things called speleothems, if you're familiar with them. They're basically calcium carbonate stalactites or stalagmites, if you're familiar with those. Sort of incremental studies within those over the last 12 to 14,000 years, and you can see sort of a general shift towards dry into much wetter conditions in a number of different locations in Mexico. One of the interesting things when thinking about the processes involved with maize domestication is that the environment that these plants are growing in, and we're actually seeing this in a large number of plants now. This is a big area of focus for archaeologists and geneticists working on different kinds of domesticated plants around the world, is that these different conditions actually favor morphological changes or differences compared to what we see in the contemporary progenitor species, like the teosinte. So this is actually an experiment that was done by Dolores Paperno, who's at the Smithsonian, a good collaborator of mine. And basically what she did was she thought about, okay, what are the CO2 concentrations and the temperature of that maize or teosinte would have been growing in at the time, and could that have actually created a plant that looked very different than what teosinte looks like today? And this is actually an area within biology that's being studied much more now, known as phenotypic plasticity. So you can actually have same genetic makeup, but under different conditions, that the species that you're looking at could look very different, could have very different phenotypic expression. And that's what she found. So she grew teosinte under conditions similar to the late Pleistocene, when the domestication would have occurred. And this very branchy teosinte that occurs in today's environment actually started looking very similar to corn, like with a single stalk, with the seed pods or the cobs actually attached to a centralized stalk. Okay, so And even some of the, even like things that look like cob features in the plant. So this is important when you're thinking about the people that were there at the time and what were the plants that they were actually interacting with, and that would have changed essentially their decisions in terms of, it may have made it more attractive to human foragers at the end of the Pleistocene. Another interesting dimension that's been highlighted, not just in maize, but in a variety of species, is that during the Pleistocene, you have a large number of large animals, megafauna, certainly in the Americas, but also in Eurasia as well. And when human populations were lower in these areas, and like in the Americas, there may not have been people here at all, or very small populations. You have these large animals are really important seed dispersers. So they're targeting certain plants. Some of the really important ones are the squashes that are probably being eaten by wild squashes are being eaten by these animals. And then through that, they're eating them and then basically pooping out the seeds, and that's the perfect environment to be dispersing that plant over a large landscape. Tree crops as well, so avocados and other fruit trees were probably really important early, that were dispersed by things like gomphotheres and different kinds of horses, bison. This is actually some at the end of last year. I was on sabbatical last year, so I went and did a lot of fun stuff. So I went to Colombia to a conference, and the main reason I went there was to go and see this rock art, which is late Pleistocene rock art that has images of giant ground sloths and horses in it. That's out in the Amazon of Colombia. And so before humans are really even on the landscape, you've got these animals that are basically almost not domesticating, but they're having a biological effect on these plants, almost like priming these plants for humans to come in and interact. And of course, we know at the end of the Pleistocene, in the Americas, many of these animals go extinct, and humans are coming into the scene. So they basically take over the role of the seed dispersers, and that sort of primes the pump for the major biological changes associated with domestication. Okay, so that's another area that's being explored now in thinking about this transition to agriculture. Of course, there's been a lot of interest in the origins of agriculture in the Americas, and this was really primed in the late 1950s and 1960s by a guy named Scotty McNeish in the highlands of Mexico. He went there because some of the rock shelter sites in this area basically had incredible preservation of botanical materials. So unlike that site that I talked about in the Balsas area, where they weren't getting cobs or seeds of different kinds of plants, they're basically getting pollen and starches and these things called phytoliths that come from plants, like silica bodies, microscopic things. These sites actually had amazing preservation of all different kinds of plants that people were interacting with over about 10,000 years in the Tehuacan Valley. And in this case, these early studies, he discovered ancient maize cobs. And he defined this kind of a general trajectory through time, from very small cobs, maybe with 2 to 4 rows occurring in the site, and then through time, basically increases in the numbers of rows, the size of the cobs, leading to sort of the late phase in the Tehuacan Valley, these larger cobs with multiple rows, something much more comparable to the corn that we're used to. And this was actually the story that I was exposed to as an undergraduate at the University of Rhode Island. I had an amazing professor there when I first started off as an undergraduate. He told the story, and he had these images. They were drawings, not pictures, but of this transformation of corn. That really captured my imagination. It turns out that this progression here, it's more complicated than that, but there is a general tendency towards that, and that's what subsequent research on lots of different archaeological sites in the Americas, including the American Southwest and the Northeast, and down, all the way down into South America. We're getting, a more complex picture of the transformation of this important crop. So some of the earliest cobs that we have in Mesoamerica today, actually the actual macrobotanical, don't come from the Balsas area. So we don't have any material from that particular area, sort of the heartland of domestication. But fairly nearby in the valley of Oaxaca, there's a site called Guianaquites. In the early 2000s, the site was excavated by a very famous archaeologist named Kent Flannery, and Dolores Paperno worked with him to analyze a very small number of cobs. And they were similar to what McNeish had seen in the Tehuacan Valley, with it sort of 2 to 4 rows. But the distinctive aspect of these was that it was not teosinte. It wasn't a single row of seeds. And also the attachments, one of the major changes in many plants is actually the attachment between the seed and the cob, or the seed and the stalk. There are these things called rachis that are basically, in a wild plant, those are very fragile. So when when the seed gets to sort of fruition, it's time to reproduce in a natural way. Those things break in the wind, or an animal knocks it or whatever, and those fall off, and the plant grows. That's what humans do initially in the domestication process. They control that. They control the reproduction of the plant by selecting for plants that have that it's more rigid, and basically the seed has to be removed by hand purposely. Okay, so that's controlling the reproduction of the plant. And we see that although these cobs are small, they're domesticated in the sense that the reproduction of this plant is now under control by 6,300 years ago. We have direct evidence for that from this rock shelter site called Kennett in the highlands. And that just brings us sort of in terms of this thinking about process. This is a really nice paper by Brandon Goud, who's actually he's a plant geneticist, but kind of thinking about seed dispersal and going from sort of the wild varieties of any kind of plant. And here's that sort of through time, where essentially the wild configuration is that the seeds fall off naturally. And then through time, you have managed populations, and then cultivation, and then dispersion and breeding, different kinds of interactions that people have with plants. And through time, you get more and more control of that reproduction. So the seeds are staying on. So essentially the plant is completely dependent upon humans for reproduction. Okay. So we see the first stages of that, physically with the remnants of these early cobs from Guianaquites by 6,300. And then, so just to kind of, there's a map that I'll come back to at the end of the talk. This just kind of shows you in the Americas where we have the earliest evidence for corn or maize in the area. So here's that Balsas area that I was talking about, so 9,000 years ago. And then you have dispersal of it fairly early down into South America. So almost by 7,000 years ago, there's corn that's being grown in the Amazon basin, but also up in Colombia and Ecuador, and down into even down into Peru. And then you have much later dispersal up into North America, sort of more northern latitudes. There's more difficulty with temperature, seasonal temperature variations and water availability, those sorts of things. So it there's some adaptations in the plant that are required before you get dispersal up into North America, but that's happening by about 4,500 years ago. And then very late dispersal into Eastern North America. What's interesting in terms of the domestication story of maize, though, is that it disperses very early when it's actually a pretty small plant. Like, it looks like it's, there's not a whole lot going on with it, but people are interested in it enough where it's being traded over a wide region. And what we see is like, so those early cobs from the Tehuacan Valley and the Valley of Oaxaca, although there hasn't been a genetic study on those yet, but there's some cobs that are of a similar variety in the Tehuacan Valley. These ones date to about 5,300 years ago, so pretty early, but they're 2 to 4 rows, similar to the Oaxacan ones that I described earlier. There's been a genetic study on these now, and genetically, it confirmed that this is a domesticated plant, so the alleles um, that related to domestication, particularly that branching architecture of the plants and some aspects related to the adhesion of the seed to the cob, those are fixed and similar to modern maize. But there are actually a number of alleles for like starch synthesis and things like that that are not modern, like modern maize. They're like teosinte. So it's almost like it's a hybrid at this point of the two. Some people call it a semi-domesticated, but it truly is domesticated, but it's not. A lot of the secondary improvements that we associate with corn haven't actually occurred. And yet this plant is dispersed over a very wide area early on, okay? So we have corn cobs here, so almost exactly the same age, a site called Paradones down on the Pacific coast of Mexico, dates to 5,500 years ago, with a direct radiocarbon date. Has multiple rows, so it's actually much more developed. There's more, the secondary improvement has been occurring in this cob outside of the domestication center. So we have very early dispersal and some pretty rapid transformations of the plant itself outside and down of Mexico and down into South America. And one of the interesting aspects of this is some work that I was involved with as a team member, driven by a geneticist at UC Davis, Jeff Rossi-Barra. This published this in 2023, showing that early cob that I just showed from South America, it's very distinctive genetically than almost every other corn cob that we have prehistorically. And it basically has essentially a pure parviglumis that important early teosinte variety, and what the genetic studies show to be the progenitor species. It's most related to that, but then everything else, even things that date to 5,300 in Mexico and in the American Southwest, dating to 4,000, 3,000 years ago. And then all modern varieties of corn, they have admixture with the other variety of teosinte, Mexicana. So there's an important admixture event that occurs that then maybe like supercharges corn, and then it becomes the dominant, it gets spreads out again and then becomes a sort of a dominant variety over throughout the Americas, but then ultimately globally. So if you go to China, where they're growing lots and lots of maize, or Africa, those and all the maize that's grown here, it's all a mixture of ancestry that's both parviglumis and Mexicana. So essentially, the title of this paper was basically the importance of two teosintes in the domestication process. And in this, we basically proposed sort of an early dispersal of corn that was probably these small cobs, and then they were manipulated, and you get that down in South America. And we have evidence of that from this one early cob from coastal Peru. And then subsequently, after 6,000 years or 6,000 years ago, there's some admixture with Mexicana, and then a widespread dispersal of corn that occurs more widely back down into South America. But then this is also that provides the genetic material in the plant that can actually adapt to conditions that are farther to the north in North America. Okay, so that's a little bit of a sort of a background to like the genetics and some of the archaeology. Not so much on the paleoecology. We'll talk a little bit more about that in this next section. But now I want to talk about some of the archaeological research we've been doing in a couple of different sites in Central America that speak to some of these issues, and kind of where we've been able to add a little bit more nuance to the story of the movement of corn. So this is a site that I've been working on with a team out of Penn State. So I was at Penn State for about 7 years, and a graduate student in Penn State in the early 2000s excavated a site in Honduras that was very similar to the sites in the Tehuacan Valley. And because of the preservation of materials, that incredible preservation of botanical materials in sort of a intermediate elevation down in Honduras. So not down in the lowland tropics, but kind of up a little bit higher elevation, but not as high as some of the high elevation sites in Mexico. And the name of the site is called El Gigante. Okay, so it's a massive rock shelter site. So here's a photograph showing the rock shelter site. And because of this rock shelter, there's preservation of botanical material because it wasn't getting wet. And wetting and drying, which you get in the tropics, and that just destroys all the botanical material, unfortunately. So this is a fairly unique site in that regard. So Tim Scheffler is the name of the graduate student. He's now does contract work in Hawaii now. That's where he's doing. And then he worked with one of my good colleagues, Ken Hirth, who's just retired from Penn State, excavating a large number of excavation units here. In the site, here's some of the stratigraphy showing sort of the stratigraphic lenses going down that we were able to gather samples from. And essentially, what you don't get from this photograph is just chock full of plant material, ancient plant material that spans the last 12,000 years. Okay, so some of these lower deposits are a little over 11,000 years old. All the way through the last 10,000 years. So here's just some pictures of some of the preservation of these materials. So here's some of the maize cobs that we have from El Gigante, some maguey quids, squashes, seen as squash seed here, different varieties of squash, and then a large number of tree crops and seeds, including avocados. We just had a paper earlier this year on avocado domestication from the same site. Over the last 10,000 years. So we have very early avocados. We've done a bunch of direct radiocarbon dating on these sites. So these are each one of these is a probability distribution for a radiocarbon date going back to, you can see, over 11,000 years is sort of the start date. And we have lots and lots of botanical material dating through up to about 7,400. Then we unfortunately have a gap in the record, which is a real bummer. But for some reason, there's a gap in the record. And then 4,200 to 300, the assemblage picks up again, and it's just chock full of maize. We actually had 10,000 pieces of maize from this one section. And overall in the site, there's probably, I think, 23 to 24,000 identified macrobotanical remains. So it's a pretty remarkable site. So then we have, so this is a fairly recent paper in PLOS One looking at the chronology of some of the tree crops and the field crops. And we have, again, corn going back to 4,000 years ago. But earlier on, we've got lots and lots of squashes and tree crops. And so there's already like an agricultural system that's like developing, and lots of interaction with plants and manipulation of plants that's happening very early in time. And then corn comes into that context, and there's like a lot, major transformations. But by the time it gets here, it's not the very small cobs. It's something that's more intermediate between the small cobs and these larger cobs that we see later on in time. And then this figure just shows basically the transformation with the introduction of maize. And its increasing importance. We see basically a shift from sort of tree crop kind of economy. Agriculture's focused on those don't go away. There's still avocados that continue, and other kinds of wild plums and domesticated plums. that occur later in time, but it just starts, the corn just starts to eclipse the importance of other plants in the record. And this is something that we see fairly commonly in a lot of these areas, starting after about 4,000 years ago. So 4,000 seems to be a pretty critical interval of time for this transformation. So this is a paper we published in 2017, describing the maize assemblage in particular. Lots and lots of direct radiocarbon dates on cobs, the earliest ones looking like this. Not too dissimilar from what's going on later. So we actually made an argument in this paper that by 4,200 years ago, corn is probably starting to become a staple crop. So it's not just being experimented with and used at a fairly low level, which occurs earlier in time. It's actually there are biological changes, and it's been engineered to a particular, to a certain degree where it actually is it can be actually serve as a major staple grain. And this is just some of the measurements that we made on some of the maize cobs, some of the guianaquites, early materials, just showing the number of rows here, just as an example. Small numbers of rows, and then some of the stuff from the Tehuacan Valley. And then we have the blue dots are the El Gigante samples that we have measurements on. So basically there we have, increases in the number of row numbers and size of the cobs themselves. And that then persists through time. So again, 4,000 being a pretty critical moment in time within Mesoamerica. And that also looks like it's the case in the Tehuacan Valley, where we have smaller numbers of samples. Another sort of magical thing that came out of this particular this El Gigante site in Honduras is not only is the plant material well preserved, but it's sort of a genetic time capsule. There's actually genetic preservation in the plants themselves. So we worked with Logan Kistler, who's also at Penn State and now is at the Smithsonian. He's an archaeologist, but he's like an archaeogeneticist. He's an archaeologist, but then he uses genetic techniques on ancient materials, which is really hard to do. And we were able to extract genetic DNA from some of the cobs from El Gigante, and we published this paper in 2020, which had sort of a remarkable result, which is a lot of the focus has been on the dispersal of corn out of Mexico down into South America and then up into North America. What we showed here is that there was actually a backflow of genetic material and crops coming from South America, probably after secondary improvement in South America. It's the stuff in El Gigante actually looks like it's more related to some South American varieties. So we made an argument for the backflow and trade of material coming from South America back up into Central America being perhaps an important aspect of this transformation at 4,000 years ago. So again, like a sort of a genetic supercharging of that material that made the plant much more interesting to people to invest more in, which we know happens later on in time. That's essentially the foundation of Maya societies and Teotihuacan, all these big centers that make corn is a very important crop in these areas. Another site, or a couple of sites where we've generated data that speak to this particular issue are two sites from Belize that I've been working with a team of people. Keith Proofer is the primary archaeologist that I've been working with down in that area on this project for about 20 years now. We've been working very closely with Mopan and Kekchi Maya communities on this particular problem. And we have, similar to the Honduras, they're rock shelter sites. So they're kind of special sites, and these are down in the tropical lowland Maya region, where preservation tends to be pretty bad in open archaeological sites. And we've been working at a couple of sites called Maya Hot Pek and Saki Sul, which are in a national park in what are called the Maya Mountains in Belize. Really hard place to get to, like about a day walk if you're gonna walk in there, which many of us do, or walk out. But then the project's gotten so big that we have to go in and out via helicopter to get material in and then the materials out. Food and stuff, equipment in, and then equipment and archaeological materials out. Thousands of pounds of materials. So you basically have to go in and clear the jungle so that the helicopter can actually get in and out of this location. Okay. So, and one of the reasons they're preserved is that there are no people in this general area. There's some park rangers, but they've been largely preserved because there's just nobody in the general vicinity. And what's amazing about these rock shelter sites is, unfortunately, we don't have great plant preservation. We have some, but all the plants are carbonized, so we can't do a lot of genetic work on that kind of material. It's more limited, but there's this remarkable sequence of human burials that occur in these two rock shelters spanning the last 10,000 years. And probably earlier, we actually don't know. We have Pleistocene sediments with human material. We can't get direct dates on them, but so they're kind of at the interface. There could be very early human material there as well. But these were persistent burial sites over 10,000 years. And again, similar to El Gigante with the plants, these are molecular time capsules. Like the genetics in the human remains and other materials are incredibly well preserved. So we've been able to look at, and then other biochemical markers. We've been able to kind of study and interrogate the structure of this population over time. So these are just some of the excavation units going down into these two rock shelter sites. In a couple of years ago, I can't remember the exact date. So 2020, I think, we published a study on a sequence of human remains using stable carbon and nitrogen isotopes to look at not just the presence of corn, but how frequently or how much people were consuming it. So in the carbon isotopes, you can usually see that in an area like this. So the predominant locally available plants, they have a very specific kind of photosynthetic pathway. It's called the C3 pathway. And you have very distinctive isotopic signature if you're just eating plants from that environment. Corn has what's called a C4 photosynthetic pathway. And you have basically a major shift in the isotopic composition of our bones and hair and fingernails if you're eating a lot of corn. In fact, a lot of us probably have that because we have a lot of corn starch and sugar, syrup in our diets and drinks and things like that. And so we were able to, in this sequence of human remains, interrogate this question about when did people start eating a lot of corn? Because we can see that as in terms of a biomarker in the carbon isotopic composition. So here's some of the data from that. So these what we call a pre-maize diet in yellow. Then we have what's called a transitional maize diet in blue, and then in orange we have what we're calling a staple maize diet. This gray dots in the background of each of these, those are essentially isotopic measurements that have been made on classic Maya populations, which we know are eating a lot of corn. Okay, and you can see here's the carbon isotopes here. So the classic Maya populations are here, and they all have what are called delta C13 values that are more enriched than negative 14. So 14 through negative 8. That's where the isotopic concentration occurs. The very earliest populations, this pre-maize, this is what a C3 signature looks like. So early on, at about 10,000 to 7,000 years ago, we have people that are foraging in a forest and hunting animals that are eating C3 plants, and they're probably eating tree crops of different kinds. They could be eating squashes. Squash is a C3 plant, so there could be some agricultural crops that they're eating. But there's a big shift in the isotopic composition of these individuals through time. And this is what it looks like. So these are all of the skeletons we've been able to directly radiocarbon date because of the preservation. So we have, again, going back to about in 9,500, just shy of 10,000. We have these individuals here. These are the probability distributions of the radiocarbon dates. So you could match it down here to 9,500. And you can see the yellow pre-maize diet predominates through this section here. And then by about 4,700, we start seeing increases in the consumption of some kind of C4 plant. And there aren't that many naturally occurring C4 plants. So we're interpreting this as corn that's coming in and being eaten enough where it's registering in the isotopic signature of these of the individual skeletons. And then by 4,000 years ago, so about contemporary with when we start seeing those larger cobs at El Gigante, we see a shift to a pretty strong consumption of corn, of a C4 plant, presumably corn, and then persists going up to about 1,000 years ago, that's when sort of the burial activity at the site ends. So we've got a lot, so we've got sort of a nice confirming sequence in the human biology and consumption and subsistence story with the skeletons. In addition, we've done some genetic work at that same site, and there's some interesting patterns that we see there that are kind of interrelated to the story of movement of corn coming up from South America into Mesoamerica late in time. We've done something similar. So we looked at the genetic composition. This is with David Reich at Harvard University, his genetic lab. So we looked at that same sequence that we directly dated and done isotopes on it. We've done the whole genome sequencing of all of those individuals. And what we see is that there's sort of an early population. Actually, the earliest population here is related to Clovis individuals. So if you've heard of some of the studies that have been done, some of the early Clovis skeletons in North America, that looks very similar here. So that suggests that there's a fairly rapid movement of populations that are coming into the Americas that have that signature that are related to Clovis. And then we have a major shift in the genetic structure of the population at about 5,600 years ago. Again, unfortunately, we have a little bit of a gap in the record. And for this study, last time we filled that in with subsequent work. When we publish it another time. But basically, we have this early populations here that are kind of related to Clovis, so the early colonists into this tropical forest. And then we have a shift that kind of corresponds. It's a little bit earlier than the isotopic shift that we see in a population that looks like it's coming from lower Central America or South America. They're actually most related to in a sort of a modern survey of indigenous populations from the Americas, most closely related to Chibchan speaking populations in Costa Rica and in Colombia. Okay, so it looks like could be not just a movement of corn and other domesticates coming up, but people could also be coming up in small numbers. And it's not a replacement of the population, they're intermarrying and coming together. And so there's a change genetically that we see in the record, but it's very strong. All Maya people have this. It's 50% of their genome is from this movement of people from South America or lower Central America. So we've been able to use, again, these genetic techniques to get at this structure. Okay, so I've gone longer than I thought. So I guess just quickly, this project that I'm working on with this group at UC Davis and UC Santa Barbara, also Kelly Schwartz from the University of Vienna. We're looking at it's a broad survey looking at maize genetics and also human genetics throughout the Americas to see what looking at coevolutionary processes related to human interactions with corn and what that would mean for population history, so essentially demographics. So our argument in this proposal that was funded by the National Science Foundation, and we've held on to the money so far, so that's good, is that, you know, once you have domestication, humans and corn or any other domestic become interlocked. So when you have more people, you're going to have more corn, and when you're going to have less people, if you have like the Maya collapse or something like that, you're going to have, or at a historic contact, you have population crashes, you're going to have the overall population size of corn is also going to go down because people have to grow the corn. So there's a symbiotic relationship. So we're trying to look at that using contemporary genetic tools, and then trying to use the archaeological record to calibrate some of that data. So that's our goal. This is that same map. So this is actually from the proposal that we wrote to the National Science Foundation. You know, thinking about sort of where corn is, how it spreads, its dispersal. And then more specifically in each of these regions, so we've kind of broken it down into 10 different regions where we had some reasonable archaeological data and also coverage in terms of genetic information for corn and for humans. Yeah, so that shows you this. So these are some of the data sets that we have. So there's lots and lots of data, genetic data on contemporary land races of corn throughout the Americas. Then we also have human data that we can also look at sort of the population structure using contemporary or sort of new genetic tools to look at population sizes through time. And then to combine those to see what the relationships are over the last 12,000 years or so. And then using the archaeological record, and this is just the example that we use in the proposal, where we had a lot of information from the Maya region because of work that I've been doing with folks down there for a very long time. Using archaeological data like some probabilities of radiocarbon dates from archaeological sites, so as a proxy for population size. So sort of here just showing after 4,000 years ago, when we had maize really coming in and becoming very important, populations start to tick up. And then by 3,000, they really start going up. And then by the sort of peak classic Maya period, populations are very high. We see that these are radiocarbon dates, but then we also see that in the numbers of sites and households and things like that at centers. So we're basically trying to pull together archaeological data in a variety of ways, and then the microbotanical and macrobotanical data sets from these areas that we can then calibrate with the genetic evidence that we're getting to sort of look at this very important, what we would argue is a very important relationship between humans and this staple grain in the Americas. That, of course, was the foundation for a lot of the emergent complex societies like the ancient Maya and other sites in South America and in the American Southwest and North America. So thank you. Questions? Locally questions?
When you had all those different pictures of corn on your first slide,
Yeah.
are those just
Oh, yeah.
different varieties that are still being grown?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. There's still a huge diversity of corn that.
The question was,
Yeah.
are the local varieties of corn still being grown?
Yes. Yeah. So he was referring to the first slide, which there had a lot of different varieties, small ones, large ones. Of course, they're
Different colors.
popcorns, like they're little small popcorns. In fact, that's thought to be some of the first domesticated varieties that occur in the Americas. But then you have ones that are focused in on like starch and sweet corn and different colors. So in the Americas, the highest diversity of modern land races is in Mexico. But I can tell you, I was in Peru this summer, and there's a huge variety of corn, corn varieties there too, that people are growing. So yeah, there's a lot of diversity. I think, with the contemporary GMO, genetically modified corn, and the large scale corn that is being grown in a lot of these places around the world, there's concerns about sort of the loss of genetic diversity. And we've made some arguments to NSF and elsewhere for like a site like El Gigante that actually is a source of genetic information about ancient varieties that were highly adapted to those environments. So there's been some loss of varieties, but there's still many that are occurring today. Other questions?
I have a question.
Yes.
You mentioned that more rows became more popular in the Americas for your study. I did my master's research on maize morphology in Arizona and southeastern Utah, and I found
cool.
that rows became decreased. Like they were basket maker 2 time period, they were more robust with a number of rows, but as Puebloans came in, it seemed like they were selecting the bigger kernels and lower row count.
Huh. Interesting. Yeah, I mean, I think there is, there's I didn't highlight it, but at the site El Gigante, which I had the most familiarity with, you have the earlier cobs, which are kind of, they're smaller generally than the later ones, so sort of on average. But there's what we see in the cobs that date to what's called the formative period down there, about 2,500 years ago. That's where most of the 10,000 maize remains actually come from. They're really coming from that interval of time, and there's a huge diversity. So there's small ones and large ones. So I think there are probably multiple varieties that they're growing for different reasons, which is what you see in contemporary Maya communities anyway. They have a number of different varieties that they're maybe growing at different, they have a sort of a short growth season variety, a long growth season, and they're kind of using those varieties strategically because they're trying to minimize risk. Because they don't know exactly what the climate's going to do. Is it going to be rain? When's the rainy season going to come? When's it going to end? Those sorts of things. And then interestingly, related to what you're talking about, in South America right now, there are 2 sites that I know of. One was recently published in a journal called Science Advances. That's from Brazil, I believe, where they're actually very late in time, and they're big cobs that are occurring there. But there's also things that look like that very ancestral maize, like from the Valley of Oaxaca, that date to the same time period. And there's also a site, I was at this conference that I went to in Colombia, where the rock art, I saw that rock art. There was a paper by a guy from Venezuela where he described exactly the same thing, almost the same time period. So I think you're right. It's not McNeish talked about it as sort of a unilinear thing. And there's, I think, a general tendency towards that, but there's lots of variability that's occurring. It's really interesting.
Thank you.
Did you publish that? I'm not sure who I was talking to. I'm confused.
David Bond.
Oh,
David Barr, question to you was, did you publish that?
I'd be curious to know more about it.
No, that never got published. Just my unpublished thesis, as all universities do. So.
Okay, got it.
I have a question,
Yes.
and it's related to your National Science Foundation work that's ongoing.
Yes.
You started out with the Maya. Are you looking at other societies and trying to do the same kind of analysis?
Yeah, so the Maya was what we used as sort of because we had a lot of data from that region, so we used that in the proposal sort of as a model for what we wanted to do for the overall project. So our goal, which is an ambitious goal, is to try to collect data in each of the 10 areas that we defined in that map. So that would be, and so we have 5 years of funding, and we have 2 postdocs currently that are helping us to basically gather that archaeological data. That's being done in tandem with the more sequencing and analysis of the genetics of the maize and the humans, which I'm not involved with that part of the project, but that's being done primarily at UC Davis. So
Yeah,
it's like,
I'm a little more familiar with the UC Davis genetics aspect, so
yeah.
it's good that you're knowing, you know.
Yeah, it's been really fun. It's sort of a new collaboration in the last 3 years. Yeah, so it's yeah.
Great, thank you.
You're very welcome.
There was a question.
Sorry if I'm not looking at you directly. I'm not exactly sure where I'm supposed to be looking. I'm confused. I don't know.
With regards to the plasticity.
Yes,
The phenotype plasticity.
Yes.
What control was that experiment and what variety was it?
so they used, she used Zea Maize parviglumis. And what was available, seeds that were available to her, I think through the USDA, there's basically seed stores that you can kind of get. So she grew those and the chambers were at Smithsonian they have a botanical facility, and she grew those. But they did multiple, I think it was multiple crops that she grew under those conditions.
Interfered the process of that particular seed.
Cross pollination with other maize, you mean? Yeah, no, but they're inside, it's controlled. It's controlled, very controlled. Yeah. Because she has to control the CO2 content of the atmosphere around the plant and the temperature. So they're actually controlled greenhouses essentially that are, so there's no, of course, even in DC, it's not in the city, it's on the outskirts. There's probably corn and corn pollen that's flying around, but not in those chambers. Yeah. Good question.
Yes.
There's some question.
More questions over here? Sorry, I'm not sure where I'm supposed to look there.
There's some questions in the chat.
Here we go. $13K domesticated.
Okay, there's a question that says 13,000 K domestication, okay, but then microscopic evidence domestication at 9,000. You said both. Please explain 13,000-year-old evidence. Yes, okay. That's kind of a bit of a pet theory that I have in terms at this moment. There's a new genetic study that followed on the Chen et al. Study from 2002 that pointed to parviglumis being the progenitor species, and then using statistical techniques to look at the molecular clock. They said actually a pretty wide range. I think it was something like 13,000 to 8,000, and they kind of settled on 9,000 as being the likely time that it was domesticated. But there've actually been a subsequent study fairly recently where they've used more data and then much more sophisticated statistical techniques, and a number of them, and they all kind of settle between like 10,000 and 13,500 or something like that as being the interval when maize was likely domesticated. So, and I think that's pretty important because what happened with that early genetic study, that one in 2002, there was then one archaeological project that went out into the area where purposely to try to find material, and they found material dating to 9,000 years or close to 9,000. So it's kind of like, oh, well, now the archaeological data matches, an interpretation of the genetic data, so it must be 9,000. And then people stop looking. It's like, okay, we've already figured that out. Move on to the next question. But I suspect that it's that in the genetic data, new genetic data would suggest that it's earlier in time, and that we should be going back into the Balsas area and doing more archaeological research to really
I'm not
interrogate
sure.
that more. Sorry? Yeah, so that would be my argument for that. But there's no archaeological evidence earlier than 9,000. And those aren't cobs, those are starches and maize vitalists. People know what I'm talking about when I say that? It's like in the stalks and cobs of of corn, you get these cells that have silica walls, and they're amazing because they preserve, because silica is very hard. So they've like a little thing known as like phytolith plant stones, so they fall into the soil and you can find them. But people worry about that for similar reasons what you're talking about, like contamination, those sorts of issues can occur with those microbotanicals. So.
Okay. Got a comment on giant ground sloths. Dispersed Joshua tree seeds also, but
Yeah. I mean,
And
again, not just potential domestic, all sorts of different kinds of plants are being eaten and dispersed by these megafauna, remarkably. So I mean, actually, we don't know a lot about teosinte, but its architecture. So the very hard seed cover that I talked about, like it's essentially armored. That is designed to go through the gut of a plant. That's how it's going to actually germinate, to break down the seed wall. Okay, so the actual, the plant is designed to actually to be interacting with an animal that will help it propagate. Okay.
fair enough.
But another example, the avocados story, that was also dispersed by over a wide area. So there's genetic evidence that suggests that also comes from central Mexico. But it disperses down into South America well before humans ever come into the Americas. And so like 125,000 years ago. So that's animals that are eating that plant and then over time dispersing the tree over a very broad area. But then people come in and start domesticating. So there are actually 3 independent domestication events, but of plant trees that were already their distribution was being manipulated by these megafauna earlier in time. So I guess what I'm trying to argue is like, you can't just look at humans and domesticating something. There's all these other biological and ecological processes that are occurring that then changes like megafaunal extinction, and then that humans are kind of coming into and experimenting with, and sort of almost, some have argued that megafauna actually primed people to sort of transition to agriculture. So it's a fairly new body of literature that's being focused in on that particular topic.
Okay. Question on how do people select for bigger cobs and more rows through time?
Right. Yeah, I mean, there's going to be phenotypic variability in these populations, and there's just essentially selection for larger cob sizes, larger seed sizes, larger rows. So that's essentially that's the earliest agricultural engineering, is basically through trial and error experimentation and this human selection process.
Were they actively planting, here's the kinds I want? And
Yeah. So it's
Yes.
good. I mean, I think early on you have sort of interaction, and it could be not necessarily that purposeful. For like, they're essentially acting as seed dispersers, but then it becomes much more structured. And again, by 4,000 years ago, it's like very purposeful. And then later on in time, we start by 2,000 years ago, we're getting like agricultural terraces and like major investments in agricultural infrastructure that are really ballooning the overall population of corn.
and then one last question here from Eldar. See it there.
One of the glasses, map showing dates of that one?
Yes.
Okay, map showing dates of maize origins in North and South America indicates maize was in the US Southwest higher by 4,500. The most recent studies I'm aware of date to the earliest items at 2,100 BCE, yeah, 4,100. In southern Arizona and Zuni. So that is there's actually a study there's cobs that date to, there seem to be direct dates. It's hard for me to discount them. I usually do. Like I actually have expertise in radio, AMS radiocarbon dating. And there's 2 dates that date to 4,500 years ago that are in that study.
It's a,
I-
it's a, it's a,
I'd be happy to, if you send me an email, I'll send you the reference.
it's a, no. It's a simple problem. He's saying BC versus BP. You expressed it as BC.
No, but
Oh, yeah, that's-
I clarified there that it's 4100 BP compared
Yeah,
to.
yeah, 4100 BP. Yeah. That's the date that I've used for a long time, but there's this recent study that suggests 4,000. There are a couple of cobs that date to 4,500. I can't
It's called, yeah,
discount them.
yeah, it's just.
Can you
it's
tell
for
where
yeah,
those
it's
crops were
calibration.
found?
Sorry, didn't catch that.
Did you say where those cobs were found at 4,500?
Oh, I believe it's southern Arizona. Like I said, if you'd send me an email, I'd be happy to actually send you the manuscript.
Okay, I'll have to get your email address from Stephen.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Sure.
I did have one question there, though, about agriculture and dates.
Yeah.
Because we were talking about maize, and you said domestication definitely happens at 13,000, right?
No, I didn't say definitely. Not 13,000.
No, you said absolutely. Okay.
Oh.
You said okay.
What's that?
You said okay. Domestication happens at 13,000. Okay. But then we talked about 9,000. So I just want to get our dates straight here.
Yeah, right. So the genetic evidence suggests that there's a potential window for domestication between 13,000 and 10,000. That's sort of the most modern genetic studies using a genetic clock, which there's a lot of problems associated with those.
Okay.
But the earliest evidence, like direct evidence for corn, is 9,000. But what I would argue is that that's based on there's a single study that has been done in the key area where a process is known to have occurred based on no one questions that based on the genetic data and sort of the accumulation of genetic and botanical evidence.
Okay, well,
But
maybe
there hasn't been enough work in that region to really interrogate how early it possibly could. So could be. And so basically what we're stuck with is sometime earlier than 9,000. So by 9,000, according to Dolores Paperna, who did the analysis on the microbotanicals, it's fully domesticated at that point. So sometime earlier than that, but I think the big question is how much. If I said definitely 13,000, I misspoke. So
okay.
I'm not arguing that, but there is genetic evidence that suggests that it could be that early. And I think what needs to happen now is more work in that region to both archaeological, but also paleoecological, because you can do coring of lakes and things like that. But the problem is that's a very dangerous area to work in. Narcotic trafficking and all sorts of things. So
Yeah.
I did one project in coastal Guerrero and I basically gave up after 2 years. It was just even in the coast around Acapulco, it was like pretty not fun, just to be there doing the work. And Dolores Paperna had the same experience farther in the interior. And I went for a few field trips to some sites, kind of thinking about possible projects, and it was sort of a scary place to operate in. So that's what we're up against.
If you could, like, if the world was like totally safe and you wanted to go find the earliest clear-cut evidence of all the criteria of maize in central Mexico, where would you go?
I would go to sort of intermediate elevations in the Balsas River Valley in basically in Guerrero. And that would, and hopefully a rock shelter that would have some kind of preservation. Because you start getting into an area that is more tropical. So it's again, the parviglumis subspecies is sort of more of a lowland tropical. It grows better in sort of wetter conditions and more humid conditions, hotter. So the preservation in those kinds of environments tends to be pretty challenging. So I'd look for a site similar to El Gigante. It's sort of in that general vicinity.
Okay, that's cool. Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. Thank you.
That's it. Okay, and with that, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Greatly
Take care.
appreciate it.
Thank you very, very much.
Oh, all right. No, thanks.
I'd like to give this a lovely certificate,
A
suitable
certificate.
for frames,
Wow, okay.
suitable for refrigerators.
All right.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
For the website. Thank you so much. Really nice meeting you.
Thank you very much. Very much.
Yeah, yeah, thank you. Nice meeting you. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Good job.
Thank you.
So October,
Oh, yeah, that's a terrible.
the checks in the mail. The checks in the mail. So the guest speaker for next month, the October talk, is Dr. Hector Neff, who happened to teach at Long Beach at the same time as Dr. Kennett.
And we published papers together on maize, actually. He may even talk about maize a little bit, or I think he's gonna talk, what's his title?
Well, his talk is Fire Salt Ceramics and Commerce on the Pacific coast of southern Mesoamerica. So hopefully it does have something about maize.
Yeah, that's gonna be great. He has a book that just came out about that, so I'd really highly recommend it, and I think everyone should try to come and be in person for Hector. He's great, so.
And Dr. Neff is almost as nice as Dr. Kennett.
Thanks.
Thank you, everybody.
Say hello.
Thank you, everybody. Good night.
Good night.
Well,